In times of war, it is difficult to distinguish between acts of war and war crimes, but during World War II, the Japanese clearly violated international human rights laws through their inhumane treatment of civilians.
In China, the rape of Nanking and the Singapore massacre were evidence of Japan's atrocities against the civilian population. Japanese soldiers engaged in brutal warfare during the rape of Nanking. They raped, stabbed, burned, and killed thousands of innocent men, women, and children. About 20,000 women and girls were raped and murdered. An estimated 100,000 to 300,000 Chinese civilians died during the 7 weeks of terror.
Similar atrocities against civilians occurred during the Singapore massacre, where thousands of Chinese civilians were herded and interrogated. In groups, they were taken to be shot, beheaded, and bayoneted, then thrown into mass graves.
In Manchuria, the Japanese forced more than 10 million of the innocent local population into slave labor. These workers suffered from illness due to the high intensity of the labor. If the workers became too ill to do their assigned tasks, they were thrown into mass graves so that the Japanese could avoid any costly medical procedures.
Unit 731 was a Japanese mission that used biological warfare against Manchurians, Koreans, Russians, Mongolians, and Chinese. The Japanese secretly transported civilians to Unit 731 in China, where they conducted biological and chemical experiments on the effects of the bubonic plague, typhoid, anthrax, and cholera, and many other deadly infections. Although the exact numbers are uncertain, about 5,000 civilians and prisoners of war were tortured to death by Unit 731. The Japanese used the knowledge they gained from their research to create extremely lethal biological weapons, which they dropped on and infected entire cities and remote areas heavily populated with civilians.
In the Bangka Island massacre, Japanese soldiers gunned down 22 innocent Australian nurses, leaving just one survivor. The nurses were traveling with a group of wounded soldiers that they were caring for on the Bangka Island. 10 Japanese soldiers appeared and separated the soldiers and the nurses. The nurses were then ordered to walk into the surf, and when they were waist deep, the Japanese soldiers fired at them with machine guns.
The Sandakan death marches in East Malaysia are also an example of the cruelty the Japanese released on civilian population. During the marches, more than 3,600 Indonesian civilians were forced into slave labor and ultimately died. In addition, 2,400 Allied persons of war were held captive. At the end of the war, there were only 6 survivors of the marches.
The Japanese military's blatant disrespect for the welfare of civilians is clearly in violation of Article 48 of the Additional Protocol to the Geneva Convention in 1977. The protocol lays out the protections of civilians during wartime, stating that the civilian population shall not be the target of attack. When the loss of civilian life strongly outweighs the military advantage, attacks are considered indiscriminate.
In addition, the actions of Japan's Unit 731 are also in violation of the Hague Convention of 1923, rules on aerial warfare, which prohibits airstrikes that serve the purpose of terrorizing civilian or other non-military targets or combatants. Furthermore, an international humanitarian convention in 1972 called for the prohibition of the development, production, and stockpiling of biological and toxin weapons. Japan's decision to drop several biological bombs on towns throughout Asia was not in agreement with these international laws.
During the Bangka massacre, Japan also disregarded Article 15 of the 1949 Geneva Convention, which ensured the protection and respect of civilian, medical, and religious personnel.
In the past, military leaders and those in charge have been tried for war crimes and crimes against humanity. Several hundred Japanese war criminals were tried in Tokyo by Allied representatives. 7 men were executed, 18 received prison terms, and nearly 1,000 additional minor war criminals were sentenced to death for cruelty towards prisoners of war and civilians.
800 war criminals were tried for their atrocities at Nanking, and 140 people received the death penalty. However, the high-ranking officials of Unit 731 never faced the same judgments for their cruelty toward civilians. Such officials are even recognized in a war shrine built to honor heroes that is still visited today. Our Tokyo Tribunal would rightfully charge all Japanese military leaders who were responsible for the violent and inhumane military actions towards civilians in order to seek justice for the war crimes they committed.